Chapter 91 Darkfire's Decision. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Darkfire's decision. Aaron looked at Darkfire in shock. There were many things he had feared could happen in Hillfort, but Darkfire changing his mind about joining the Shadowflame Society was something he hadn't expected. "You're staying here in Hillfort?" he asked again. Leanne stood up. "I'll let the two of you talk in private," she said in a muted voice. She gave Darkfire a meaningful look, then left the room. For some moments, neither Aaron nor Darkfire spoke, Aaron still processing the news and Darkfire seeming almost fearful to say the words. Finally, Darkfire let out a deep breath. "I'm staying here," he confirmed. "At least for now. Because of her." "Because of her? You only just met her," Aaron said. "And you spent years trying to be recruited." "You're right," Darkfire replied, an uncomfortable look on his face. "I spent my entire life waiting to join the Shadowflame Society, and now that I have the chance, I'm passing it up for a woman I met just a few days ago." He sighed. "You must think I'm an idiot." "I'm just wondering what the hell is going on," Aaron said bluntly. "You disappear for a few days, and now you've suddenly changed your mind about everything." Darkfire knitted his brow in thought, seeming to struggle to find the right words. Finally, in an uncertain voice, he said, "I think I might love her." "And you're certain of that?" Aaron asked. "Despite not knowing she even existed just 2 weeks ago." "I'm not certain, not at all," Darkfire replied. "But if I stay here, I can still be recruited later. If I leave now, there will be no going back for years to come." "So you're going to give up on the Shadowflame Society?" "No," Darkfire said. "I talked it over with Leanne, and we agreed that we'll join together, eventually. Why not now?" Aaron said, a small spark of hope rising within him. If Leanne wanted to join as well, he thought, she could simply join them. "Leanne has no training," Darkfire said. "If she traveled across the border, she wouldn't be able to protect herself. And if we protected her instead, she'd only be a burden to you, and to the rest of whatever group we joined." Aaron was about to say that he would gladly help Darkfire protect Leanne, but then, he remembered Stoneheart's recruits. Beyond the border, Leanne would be like them, useless, unable to fight off even the smallest threat, and more likely to die than not. He was only barely confident that he could protect himself, so how could he possibly offer to protect another? "You're planning to train her?" he finally asked, understanding that taking Leanne across the border wasn't an option. "I am," Darkfire said. "If I teach her body refinement and swordplay, she should be strong enough in just a few years." "You're making a terrible mistake," Aaron said. Then, with a sigh, he produced 2 realm scrolls from his void bag, 1 fire and 1 wind, and pushed them into Darkfire's hands. "Give these to her. You can teach her the Windblade spell yourself." Darkfire looked at him in confusion. "Why are you doing?" he began. "If you're going to train her, you might as well do it properly," Aaron interrupted him. "When I become a novice, if you're still in Hillfort, I'll come and recruit the both of you." "So you're not angry?" Darkfire asked, a look of relief on his face. "Of course I am," Aaron said. "And I do think you're an idiot." With a shrug, he continued, "But it's your choice, not mine. And if you're willing to pass up joining the society after waiting for all those years, I doubt anything I could say would make a difference." They spent several more hours talking after that. Even if there was little more to be said, they both understood that they would soon part ways, and that this was one of the last times they would talk. When Darkfire finally left, Aaron sat in silence for some time. Then, he closed his eyes, and began training body refinement. In the days that followed, Aaron tried his best to prepare for the tournament, but he had trouble staying focused, his thoughts wandering both to Darkfire's choice and his own path. Once more, he would have to continue his journey by himself. Since he had fled Fulai City, he had met many people, but all of them had disappeared along the way. Master Zhao, Amar, Adept Kadir, Jiang Fei, Lord Jiang, it seemed like every friend he made was destined to leave. And now, Darkfire would follow their example, once more leaving Aaron to continue alone. Although some part of him was angry, he knew couldn't blame Darkfire for the decision. While they had become friends in the months since they met, they were nowhere near close enough that he could expect Darkfire to set aside his own desires for Aaron's sake. He had helped Darkfire with a realm-opening pill, of course, but then, Darkfire had initially rejected the gift. That he accepted it after Aaron insisted could hardly be taken as an obligation to spend years at Aaron's side. Yet despite knowing this, Aaron still felt a sting of betrayal in his heart, no matter how much he tried to convince himself that Darkfire's choice was his own to make. Nevertheless, as the tournament approached, Aaron shared several meals with Darkfire and Leanne. Some part of him had wanted to dislike the woman who had taken away his friend, but he was almost annoyed to find that she was both kind and smart. Still, if he did not exactly dislike her, he couldn't bring himself to like her either. Leanne seemed to sense this, and whenever the three of them met, the atmosphere was somewhat uncomfortable. Eventually, the night before the tournament, Aaron found himself in the palace garden, sharing a bottle of wine with Darkfire. This time, Leanne wasn't present, and Aaron suspected that she had chosen to give the two friends some time alone. "Have you decided yet what you're going to do?" Darkfire asked. "I have," Aaron said. He had given the matter some thought, and there was only one path he could see that would help him. "I'm going to lose." "Lose?" Darkfire frowned, as if he was uncomfortable with the idea of intentionally losing a fight. "I'll win the first few matches, then lose before I make it to the last round. If I show myself to be a disappointment, the strongest novices should lose interest, and I can join a less prominent novice." "But won't you be safer if you join a stronger novice?" Darkfire asked, his brows knitted in thought. Aaron shook his head. "Across the border, Stoneheart and the others will be most concerned with each other. The less they think I matter, the better my chances of slipping away unnoticed while they fight." Darkfire nodded slowly, although he did not seem entirely convinced. "There's one more thing," Aaron said. "I need you to ask Leanne for a favor." "Leanne?" Darkfire's eyes went wide with surprise. "I didn't think you." "Never mind, whatever it is, she'll help." "What do you need?" "I need her to find a suitable novice for me to join," Aaron said. "I don't know enough about them to make a good decision, and I don't have the time to find out." A smile appeared on Darkfire's face. "She can definitely help with that," he said. "In fact, I'll go ask her right now." Chapter 92. Before the tournament. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It was early morning when Aaron set off with Darkfire and Leanne for the tournament. Their departure caused some consternation for the steward, who tried to foist a handful of guards on Leanne, but the man relented when she pointed out that both Darkfire and Aaron could each easily take on a dozen of his strongest guards. Aaron looked around as they walked along the streets of Hillfort, and he saw that there were even more people than usual, something he'd previously thought was barely possible. The city held a festive atmosphere, and there were families walking through the crowd, all dressed in bright colors, many of them carrying baskets and bags. He could also see groups of young boys and girls, excitedly hitting each other with wooden swords in mock combat, with the occasional cry of pain when one of them attacked a bit too enthusiastically. "The tournaments are extremely popular with the people in Hillfort," Leanne explained. "Every month, they draw huge crowds, with people coming even from the villages in the region." "Can the arena even hold that many people?" Aaron asked, looking at the size of the crowd. Remembering the size of the northern arena, he could not imagine even a fraction of the people on the streets fitting inside. "You don't know?" she asked him, looking surprised. "The tournament takes place across all 4 arenas. In each arena, fights are held between all fighters who qualified there, until there are 4 left. The final 4 from each arena then face each other outside the city, with tens of thousands of spectators watching the fights. Many people skip the arenas, instead traveling outside the city to eat and drink in the hills until the fighters arrive. Tens of thousands. At this, Aaron frowned. He would prefer not to attract anywhere near as much attention. A thought occurred to him, and he asked, "Are there any good fighters at the northern arena?" "None that I know of," Leanne replied. "You should have little trouble making it through. But of course, there are some surprises at each tournament, people who hide their strength until they need it." Aaron sighed, disappointed. If he met a strong enough opponent at the northern arena, he could throw the match without raising too much suspicion, and never even have to appear in the final rounds. But for that to happen, he would need to face someone who at least looked like a worthy opponent. When they arrived at the northern arena, it was already filled with a crowd so thick the people inside could barely move. It seemed that even if most people skipped the arenas, the people who did come were still more than the arena could hold. "I'll take the lead," Darkfire said, then started to push his way through the crowd, with Leanne and Aaron following behind him. As a body refiner, Darkfire had little difficulty pushing his way through the crowd, even if his efforts did draw some cries of protest. Finally, they made it to the back of the arena, where the waiting chamber was. "I suppose there's no point in me waiting outside," Aaron said. "I'll see the two of you after the fights." "Good luck," Darkfire said before Aaron left. Then, in a low voice, he added, "And don't lose too easily. Show them at least some of what you can do." At the entrance to the waiting chamber, Aaron found over 24 guards, straining to hold back the crowd from the fighters' quarters. "Noel.N, it's Ghostblade," one of them called when he approached. "Let him through." The guards broke ranks just long enough to let Aaron slip through, then formed a line again before the crowd would get past them. Even if the people weren't trying to get inside, there were so many of them that every empty space quickly got filled. Finally rid of the constant push of the thick crowd, Aaron breathed a sigh of relief. He had never expected there would be so many people for the tournament. It was as if the entire city had squeezed itself into the arena. And yet, he knew that there were 3 other arenas in the city, each of them likely just as packed as this one. The thought filled him with some awe, and he could not help but imagine how large the crowd at the final fights would be. Freed from the crowd, he stepped into the waiting chamber, where he found several dozens of fighters already present. "Ghostblade," someone called out as soon as he entered, and when he looked, he saw that it was the same uniformed man who had also welcomed him when he first visited the arena. This time, the man seemed a lot friendlier. "Good to have you here today," the man said with a broad smile. "It'll be a while before the fights start, but you can pick a weapon right now." The man gestured to a long table upon which lay a row of swords, including various sizes and designs. When Aaron inspected the swords, he found that although the weapons were blunted, they were made of steel, and all were well made and properly balanced, very different from the wooden weapons he had used the previous time. After a short time browsing the weapons, he picked a long sword that did not look particularly special but had a good heft to it. He gave it a few practice swings, then nodded in approval. It wasn't perfect, but for now, it would do. As he waited for the tournament to begin, he looked around the chamber. A few of the fighters looked familiar, and he realized he had faced them already during his first time at the arena. Most of the others, however, Aaron hadn't seen before. Still, he could see that all of them had the easy movement of practiced fighters. Men and women, young and old, he could tell that none were like Stoneheart's recruits. Even if they might not match up to Aaron, none of them were defenseless. Time passed, and more fighters kept trickling into the chamber, until it was finally so full Aaron hardly had room to stand. Just when he began to worry that the chamber would become overcrowded, the uniformed man's voice sounded. "Listen up," the man called out. "The tournament is about to start. For each fight, I will send 2 of you into the arena. Defeat your opponent, and you can return here. Lose, and you must leave. The rules are simple. No deliberate killing, and no deliberate maiming. Any questions?" "What if my opponent tries to kill me?" a man's voice called back, although Aaron could not see whose it was. "Then you defend yourself as best you can," the uniformed man replied. Now, the first fighters will be. Seemingly at random, he selected 2 fighters from the group, then sent them into the arena. Within the chamber, Aaron and the other fighters could not see what was happening in the arena, but he knew that the fight had ended when a loud cheer sounded from the crowd outside. Some moments later, one of the 2 fighters returned, wearing a big smile along with several large bruises. The next 2 fighters were sent out only moments later, and again, a loud cheer informed those in the waiting chamber when the fight had ended. This happened several times, until finally, it was Aaron's turn. Aaron's first opponent turned out to be the burly man he had faced when he first came to the arena, and when the man heard his name called alongside Ghostblade, his face fell. "I don't suppose you'll give me a break," he said, a miserable look on his face as he and Aaron walked out of the waiting chamber. Aaron chuckled. "I promise I won't hurt you too badly," he replied. As they stepped onto the arena floor, Aaron was almost overwhelmed when he saw the surrounding crowd. Thousands upon thousands of people stood around the arena, pressed tightly against each other, waving banners and shouting at the top of their lungs. Briefly, he tried to find Darkfire and Leanne, or perhaps one of the Shadowflame novices, but the crowd was simply too large to spot them. Taking his eyes off the crowd, Aaron looked at his opponent, who was eyeing him nervously. Then, he raised his sword, preparing himself for combat. "Begin," the announcer's voice called out. With that, Aaron's first fight in the tournament had started. Chapter 93 The tournament begins. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The moment the announcer called a start to the fight, Aaron's opponent launched a series of furious attacks at him, striking over a dozen times in an instant. Aaron only barely managed to fend off all the attacks, with several almost slipping past his defense. Even as he desperately defended himself, he was shocked at the difference between their previous fights and the current one. His opponent was incomparably stronger than the last time they had faced each other. Not only did he show far more skill, he was also very clearly an unusually strong body refiner. Aaron stumbled back several paces, parrying the man's attacks as well as he could. Yet even as he defended, he was losing ground, his opponent attacking relentlessly and not leaving him even the slightest chance to counter. Panicked by the unexpected onslaught, he knew that the way things were going, he would soon lose the fight. Now, he understood that earlier, his opponent had hidden his true strength, studying Aaron's skills even as he lost match after match. He had no time to give it further thought, because right at that moment, his opponent intensified his attacks even further. Appearing to sense Aaron's weakness, he struck with such force that it shook Aaron's hands, each blow nearly knocking his sword from his grasp. Aaron knew that he could not let this continue, yet he saw no way out. Forced to defend with all his might, he simply had no way to use his sword to attack. Even attempting to counter would leave him exposed, and his opponent was too good a swordsman not to seize such a chance. That left only one option. In a desperate move, he rushed forward right as he parried yet another attack with his sword, ramming his shoulder into his opponent's chest. Although the man did not fall, the force of Aaron's charge still brought him off balance, and just that short moment was enough for Aaron to seize the initiative. Without wavering, he launched a series of blows at his opponent, attacking so violently it forced the burly man to step back in defense. Aaron knew that his advantage would soon pass, and before his opponent could recover, he struck out with all his force, slamming his sword into the man's defense in an attempt to break through with sheer strength. Yet when the two blades met, the burly man's defense did not break. Instead, caught between the power of two body refiners, the hardened steel of Aaron's sword snapped with a loud crack. For a moment, Aaron stood still in astonishment, staring at the broken blade in his hands. His opponent, however, did not hesitate. The moment he saw the opportunity, he swung his sword at Aaron in a savage strike. Acting on instinct, Aaron raised his left hand and threw up a force shield that stopped the attack in mid-air. Then, with all the strength he had, he rammed the pommel of his bladeless sword into his opponent's face. The man staggered back a pace, dazed from the impact, and before he could recover Aaron rushed toward him, first striking his face again with the pommel of the sword, then unleashing the most powerful battering force he could muster at the man. The magic attack sent Aaron's opponent flying, his body tumbling a dozen paces across the arena floor before finally coming to a stop. Even so, the man got to his feet again in an instant, raising his sword as if he was about to resume his attacks. But then, to Aaron's surprise, the man dropped his sword and called out loudly, "I concede." As the crowd erupted in cheers at the unexpected spectacle they had just witnessed, the burly man approached Aaron with a limp that was obviously feigned to trick the crowd into thinking he was injured. "Good fight," the man said, twisting his bloodied mouth in a grin. "Amaya will be pleased with your performance." With that, he started to limp toward the exit. For several moments, Aaron stood there motionless, only now fully understanding what had happened. As he began to move toward the waiting chamber, the cheers from the audience did little to lift his spirits. Amaya and the burly man had played him like a fiddle, and despite his victory, he felt like an idiot. Aaron's opponent had tested him for Amaya, and in the process had forced him to show much of his true power, not just his strength in body refinement, but his skill in magic, too. Just one fight into the tournament, any hope he had of going noticed was already lost. Had he known what was going to happen, he would simply have conceded the fight. Yet in the heat of battle, he had fought on instinct, treating the fight as if it was real. He shook his head in disgust at his own foolishness. Now that he knew the burly man worked for Amaya, he was all but certain that their meeting at the governor's palace had not been a coincidence. In all likelihood, Amaya had posted the man to the northern arena, ready to report on any skilled fighters he encountered. When Aaron and Darkfire were invited to the governor's palace, Amaya must have already known who they were, and she had most likely arranged to be there herself just to meet them. The worst thing, however, was the fight itself. Aaron's opponent had conceded the fight, but Aaron knew very well that the man could have won if they had continued. And that was just the man Amaya had posted to the northern arena, who was to say that she didn't have 3 equally strong fighters in the other arenas. So far, he had believed that only the novices themselves were a threat to him, but now, he understood that there were recruits who could match him as well. That meant the dangers beyond the border would be even greater than he had expected. With a sigh, he realized that he had gravely underestimated the situation. "Ghostblade," a voice sounded, shaking Aaron from his thoughts. He looked up and saw that it was the uniformed man. "What is it?" he asked bluntly, his mood too foul for courtesy. "Where's your sword?" the man asked. "It broke," Aaron replied. "And you still won." The man raised an eyebrow, then nodded in approval. "Well done. Now, go pick out a new one before the next fight." As Aaron made his way to the table to get a new sword, he silently cursed his own carelessness. He knew that in the months to come, he would have to be more careful. If he wasn't, his enemies were likely to defeat him without ever even having to raise a sword. Chapter 94 The tournament continues. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As he waited for his next fight, Aaron considered the situation. He had believed that he was a rarity among the recruits, vastly stronger than any of the others. Yet now, he understood that he had been misled by his own arrogance. Despite his strength, it seemed there were still other recruits who could match him, if not defeat him outright. Aside from taking his pride down a notch or two, it also meant he needed to rethink the dangers that lay ahead. If there were other recruits as strong as he was, then Amaya and the others likely didn't value him as much as he had believed. And that, he hoped, might also mean that he was less of a target than he had feared. Zaheva had said neither Amaya nor Stoneheart would allow the other to have him, but then, she had been trying to influence him. If he was merely a reasonably strong recruit, he doubted whether any of them would care enough to take action, unless, of course, they had a good opportunity. With the protection of one of them, perhaps he would be shielded from attacks by the other 2. And if he managed to win the tournament, they would be certain to try their best to win his allegiance. On the other hand, he would not be able to rely just on his own strength for protection, and that worried him. If mere recruits were this strong, then the novices themselves were bound to be truly horrifying. He had believed he would be able to match them, but now, he was starting to think his pride had gotten the better of him. Still, he decided that the best thing to do now was to abandon his old plan, and try to win the tournament, instead. For better or worse, he had already shown his strength, and there was little point in holding back. Ghost Blade. You're up next. Aaron looked up and saw that his next opponent would be a young woman. Short and slender, she did not have the appearance of a fighter, but he knew that appearance meant little. When they faced each other in the arena, Aaron began the fight cautiously, still wary from his last experience. This time, however, there were no surprises. Although the young woman was exceptionally skilled with the sword, she wasn't a body refiner, and he defeated her in short order. Relieved that this fight, at least, had gone as he intended, he returned to the waiting chamber. With many fighters already eliminated, it did not take long before Aaron was sent out to face his next opponent. Once more, his opponent turned out to be a normal but skilled fighter, and the fight posed little challenge to Aaron. Still, the first fight had left Aaron too wary to let his attention slip even the slightest bit, and in the fourth fight his caution paid off. This time, his opponent was a gaunt man with pale skin and dark eyes, and when the man attacked Aaron instantly knew it was another body refiner. Before the announcer even finished his call to start the fight, Aaron's opponent launched a fierce attack, striking ferociously as he rushed forward without any regard for his own defense. It was clear that the man intended to catch Aaron off guard and overwhelm him before he could respond. Had Aaron's first opponent not used a similar tactic, the man might have succeeded. Yet his first fight was still fresh in Aaron's mind, and in the waiting chamber, he had carefully considered the mistakes that had brought him to the edge of defeat. Now that he faced a similar attack, he was as well prepared as he could be. The moment he saw his opponent rush forward, he knew what was happening and quickly sidestepped the attack, at the same time striking a forceful blow at his enemy's undefended midriff. The gaunt man's momentum carried his body into the blade even as Aaron struck with all his strength, and in a single blow, the fight was over. Had the blade been sharp, it would have cleaved the man's body in two. As it was, the man merely doubled over and fell to the ground, writhing in anguish and clutching his belly. With a quick check on his defeated opponent, Aaron saw the man that although the man was hurt, he was not seriously injured. Satisfied, he returned to the waiting chamber. By now, the chamber was mostly empty. Just 10 fighters remained, counting Aaron, and after the next 2 fights the final round, whittling the last 8 down to 4. Although Aaron was confident in his power, he still felt tense. The fighters who had made it this far would all be strong, and now that he had decided to try to win the tournament, he could not afford to underestimate what would be his last opponent at the Northern Arena. As he waited for his final fight, he looked at the fighters who were still left in the chamber, wondering which of them would be his next opponent. All of them were Aaron's age or older, with many bearing visible scars that suggested their lives had been filled with combat. Idly, he wondered how their experiences compared to his own. When it was finally Aaron's turn to fight again, his opponent turned out to be one of the least conspicuous among the remaining fighters. Slender and slightly shorter than Aaron, with short black hair and an unscarred face, he looked more like a scribe or bookkeeper than a warrior. As they walked onto the arena floor and faced each other, Aaron closely observed the man, trying to get a measure of his opponent. Yet there was little he could read from the man's face or body. He seemed entirely relaxed, patiently waiting for the announcer to start the fight. The only useful thing Aaron saw was that the man held his sword in his right hand, while leaving the left empty. From that, Aaron suspected that he would be a mage. There was no time for further speculation, because right then, the announcer's voice called out, "Begin." In a calm movement, Aaron's opponent raised his left hand, forming a bright ball of flame that he launched at Aaron. This was something that Aaron had expected. Suspecting his opponent was a mage, he had already prepared himself to put up a force shield in an instant. Yet right as the fireball hit his force shield, Aaron suddenly felt the ground explode beneath his feet. It was only by sheer luck that he managed to jump aside in time to avoid most of the force, but even as he struggled to regain his balance, he saw his opponent moving toward him in a flash. He quickly raised his sword, ready to parry his opponent's attack, but it was already too late. A stab of pain surged through his wrist as his opponent struck, and he felt his sword slipping from his grasp. Before he could react, his opponent struck again, and there was nothing Aaron could do as the blade came to a halt beside his neck, stopping just a hair short of actually hitting him. "You lose," the man said, his face showing no sign of excitement or exertion. Shocked, Aaron nodded. There was no need to announce that he conceded, his defeat was plain for all to see. The man turned around and began to walk back toward the waiting chamber, while Aaron stared at him in astonishment. The fight had lasted only a few seconds, yet he had been utterly defeated, without even the slightest chance to resist. Only as he made his way to the arena's exit did the shock of his defeat fade, and as it did, Aaron could not help but let out a cheerless laugh. He had lost, without even getting the chance to fight in the final stage outside the city. All his worries about showing his true strength had been for naught. As it turned out, his true strength was nowhere near enough. Chapter 95 Defeated. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As Aaron walked off the arena floor, cheers and jeers sounded from the audience. Although he felt some embarrassment at suffering so public a defeat, the only part of him that had been injured was his pride, and despite his annoyance at being defeated, he could not help but be impressed by how easily his opponent had secured a victory. That the man was stronger than him was clear, but even then, he should have been able to at least put up a fight. Yet instead, he had fallen for what appeared to be a simple magical feint. His opponent had distracted him with a fireball, then used the distraction to hit him with some other kind of magic, earth, perhaps, and take him out before he could recover. It was a simple and seemingly well-practiced tactic that had left him completely flummoxed, and in a real battle, it would have cost him his life before he even knew what had happened. That he had encountered the tactic now instead of later could almost be considered lucky, but then, knowing about it would only help him if he found some way to counter it. With a sigh, he stepped past the guards at the exit of the arena, and into the mass of people that waited beyond. The crowd was loud and rowdy, so thick it was impossible to walk even a step without bumping into someone, and some of the people within it shouted at Aaron in anger, gamblers who had bet on him, he guessed. Yet even if Aaron wasn't strong enough to win the tournament, he wasn't quite so weak that he couldn't force his way through a crowd, and he did so without hesitation. The few people who tried to get in his way were unceremoniously shoved aside, and soon, he was far enough from the arena to see the crowd around him grow thinner, if only slightly. "There you are," someone called out over the noise of the crowd. Aaron looked in the direction of the voice and saw Darkfire making his way toward him through the mass of people. "Took me a while to find you in this mess," Darkfire said when he finally made it to Aaron, gesturing in annoyance at the crowd around them. "Where's Leanne?" Aaron asked, seeing that she wasn't at Darkfire's side. "Some servant came for her," Darkfire replied. "She said we should meet her in the hills outside the city, where the final fights will be." "We might as well go, then," Aaron said. "Get there before the rest of the crowd." "You don't want to watch the final fights?" Darkfire asked. "I know you had to throw your fight, but there should still be some good battles to watch." Aaron shook his head. "I didn't throw the fight. I was defeated." At this, Darkfire's eyes went wide with surprise. "That was actually real? He beat you that easily?" "I didn't stand a chance," Aaron said with a sigh. "He was stronger than me, and his tactics were better, too." "Ha!" A thoughtful expression appeared on Darkfire's face, and Aaron knew what he was thinking. If Aaron couldn't win the tournament, then Darkfire would have even less of a chance. And although Darkfire would stay in Hillfort for some more years, eventually, he was planning to cross the border, too. "I suppose I'll have to start training harder," Darkfire muttered, an uncomfortable look on his face. "Let's go," Aaron said. "I've had enough of this place." He knew it would be better for him to stay and watch the remaining fights, to see if he could learn anything more about the other fighters' skills and tactics. Yet between his fresh loss and the suffocating thickness of the crowd, he couldn't bring himself to remain at the northern arena any longer. Darkfire took a look at Aaron, then nodded. "All right," he said, and Aaron was thankful that he didn't ask any questions. They began to make their way out of the city, but although the fights hadn't ended yet, the streets were already filled with people. Apparently, Aaron wasn't the only one who had wanted to avoid the crowds. Outside the city, the roads were filled with masses that flowed steadily toward the hills, and Aaron and Darkfire had little choice but to join them in their sluggish pace. After what seemed like an eternity in the slow-moving crowd, they finally arrived in the hills. Immediately, Aaron could see why this place had been chosen for the final fights. A group of low hills lay in a rough circle, with a shallow depression lying in between them, forming what looked like a giant natural arena. Within this arena, preparations for the fights ahead were already underway, with guards keeping the area clear of spectators and servants setting up large tents. The sides of the hills were filled with numerous small groups of people, most of them groups of youths and families with children, eating and drinking as they cast interested looks at the goings-on at the center of the vale. It took Aaron and Darkfire some time to find Leanne, and when they did, they found her sitting in a comfortable bamboo chair, surrounded by servants. It seemed that although she had foregone luxury at the northern arena, she had decided to make up for it during the final part of the tournament. As they approached, Aaron could see a girl sitting in the chair next to Leanne. She was short and thin, with jet black hair and ivory-pale skin, and she was dressed in a robe as black as her hair. To Aaron's eyes, she looked to be barely 16, if that. When Aaron and Darkfire neared, the girl turned her head toward them, her dark eyes looking at Aaron with some curiosity. "Is that him?" she asked in a soft voice. "That's Ghostblade," Leanne confirmed. The girl looked at him intently. "Do you know anything about plants?" she finally asked. "Plants?" Aaron gave her a confused stare. "I will have to teach you, then," the girl said, a thoughtful look in her eyes. After a moment, she nodded and stood up. "Very well. We should get going." "Going?" Aaron asked, dumbfounded. "Going where?" The girl frowned. "Leanne told me that you were looking for a novice to join," she said. "Someone who could protect you." Was she mistaken? She wasn't mistaken, Aaron said. But. For a moment, he went silent, at a loss for words after the unexpected turn of events. "But you changed your mind?" the girl asked, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't change my mind," Aaron said, "but who are you? Can you give me a moment to talk to him?" Leanne cut in, with an apologetic look at the girl. The girl sighed, then nodded. "Just try to be quick," she said. "I want to leave before the others arrive." Leanne motioned for Aaron to follow, then walked away from the group. Aaron followed behind her, already wondering what was going on. When they were a few dozen paces away, Leanne turned around. To his surprise, there was a slight smile on her lips, and she looked as if she was rather proud of herself. "That," she said, speaking in a low voice, "is the Patriarch's granddaughter." Chapter 96 Snowcloud. You are listening at novelfull.audio. "She's what?" Aaron looked at Leanne in confusion, unsure whether he heard her correctly. "The Patriarch's granddaughter," Leanne repeated. "She arrived in the city just this morning, to see my father. She's a novice, and if you join her, none of the others will dare touch you." "But why would the Patriarch's granddaughter want to recruit me?" "She doesn't," Leanne said. "She didn't intend to recruit anyone. But my father has known the Patriarch for a long time, and when I called in some of his favors, she couldn't refuse." "You called in your father's favors for me?" Aaron looked at Leanne, surprised that she would have gone that far to help him. Whatever there was between her and Darkfire, she only barely knew Aaron. "Consider it payment for a debt I owe you," Leanne said. "I know you and Darkfire were going to travel together, and I got in the way of those plans." "That was his choice to make," Aaron responded flatly. "You don't owe me anything." "I owe you a companion," Leanne replied. Someone to watch your back beyond the border. Aaron opened his mouth to object, but then, he reconsidered. Thank you, he said after a moment. But if she's the Patriarch's granddaughter, doesn't joining her put me in the Iron Mountain faction? He remembered that the Iron Mountain faction was made up of the Patriarch's old allies, and although he didn't know much about it, it seemed like joining the Patriarch's granddaughter would certainly put him in their camp. Leanne shook her head. She's not involved in the conflict, and has no taste for politics. That's why the others won't touch her. Any attack on her would only create enemies for those responsible. Aaron rubbed his chin as he thought it over. From what Leanne said, it sounded like the perfect solution to his problems. And yet, there was something about the whole thing that felt off. Why isn't she involved? He asked after some thought. It's a fight over the future of the Shadowflame Society, isn't it? She's a herbalist, Leanne said. An accomplished one, supposedly. And from what I've heard, she cares little about other things. Suddenly, the girl's question about plants made sense to Aaron. So across the border. You'll spend the year gathering flowers and plants, Leanne said, some amusement sounding in her voice. With a bit of luck, you'll be able to avoid combat altogether. Aaron sighed at the prospect of a year spent picking flowers. I suppose it's better than dying, he said. If only slightly. So you'll join her? Leanne asked, a smile appearing on her face. It sounds like it's my best chance to return alive, Aaron said. After a moment's hesitation, he added, and thank you. I'm in your debt. I'm just looking out for Darkfire, Leanne said. If something happened because he wasn't there to help you, he wouldn't forgive himself. One last thing. Aaron began. What's her name? Dao Shuyan, Leanne replied. But people call her Snowcloud. Dao. Recognizing the name, Aaron raised an eyebrow. Leanne nodded. She and Darkfire are family, albeit very distant. With a laugh, she added, so you could say I traded you one sword for another. Understanding that he had to decide, Aaron took some moments to give the matter more thought. Regardless of what Leanne believed, he doubted that joining the Patriarch's granddaughter would help him avoid trouble. Even if she could protect him from his current problems, he was all but certain that joining her would merely create new ones. Still, the offer was tempting. As the granddaughter of the Patriarch, the girl should have answers to many of the questions that plagued him. And even if she didn't, she would certainly know someone who did. Moreover, joining her meant he could avoid choosing one of the factions in the Shadowflame Society. With as little as Aaron knew about the situation, delaying a choice like that could save him a great deal of regret. It was a difficult choice, but of all his options, this seemed like the best one. All right, he finally said. I'll join her. Leanne gave him a pleased look. Let's go tell them. They walked back to the group, and even as they approached, Snowcloud turned toward them. Have you decided? She asked, a hint of impatience in her voice. I have, Aaron said, nodding. I'm joining you. Good, she replied. Then stop wasting time, and let's go. Right now. We're not staying to watch the tournament. Why would we? She asked, a chill in her soft voice. There's little point in watching some recruits beat each other with blunt swords. What about the auction? Most of the influential novices would be present at the auction, and Aaron had hoped to use the chance to find more information about the other novices in Hillfort. Even if he wasn't going to participate, he would at least have liked to see it. If you think I'm going to bid on you, you're mistaken, she said in a flat voice. Now get ready. I've waited long enough. Just give me a moment, Aaron replied, understanding that there would be no delaying his departure until another day. He turned to Darkfire, and when he did, there was a heavy feeling in his heart. Although they had only known each other for some months, Darkfire was one of the few true friends he had made during his travels, and now, their ways would apart. BL.net. Their farewell was short, and more sudden than either of them had expected. Taken by surprise, neither of them had the time to find the right words, and there was little they could say that had not been said already. As they said their goodbyes, Aaron knew he would miss Darkfire's company in the months to come. Although he would not be alone this time, what little he had seen of Snowcloud convinced him that her company would be far less pleasant than Darkfire's. "So you'll return once you're a novice?" Darkfire finally asked. "I will if I can," Aaron replied. "And I'll keep the two of you safe across the border, if you still want to go by then." "Then we'll train as hard as we can," Darkfire said. "So we won't be a burden when you return." Aaron glanced at Snowcloud, who was waiting with an impatient look on her face. "I suppose I'll have to go," he said, suppressing a sigh. "Stay safe," Darkfire said. The look on his face said there was more he wanted to say, but no words came forth. Aaron nodded, then turned to Snowcloud. "Let's go." Just moments later, they were on their way, leaving Hillfort behind, and Darkfire with it. When Aaron turned to look back, he saw Darkfire and Leanne standing next to each other on the hill, their hands locked together as they watched Aaron and Snowcloud depart. He gave them a final wave, then turned back to the road ahead of him. Although he didn't know whether he would see Darkfire again, some part of him suspected that their paths had separated for good. Aaron and Snowcloud walked in silence for the better part of an hour. Although Aaron had many questions he wanted to ask, the girls seemed to have little interest even in friendly conversation, much less answering questions. "I have some questions," Aaron said finally, no longer able to control himself. "About the Shadow Flame Society." Snowcloud looked at him, then shook her head. "I'll answer your questions, but only after we reach the society and you take the oath." "There's an oath?" Aaron asked. "What kind of oath?" "You'll find out when we get there," she replied. "It should only take us a week or two." Chapter 97 The Valley. You are listening at novelfull.audio. This is white witch flower. You can tell it apart from white dragon flower by looking at the edges of the leaves, which should be serrate rather than dentate. White witch flower is a powerful poison, while white dragon flower has potent healing properties. Now, if you look at the... Aaron suppressed a yawn, trying his best to feign interest. Snowcloud was usually cold and quiet, barely speaking at all for hours on end. Yet whenever they encountered plants and flowers she deemed interesting, she would launch into lengthy monologues on their medicinal properties and how to tell them apart. To Aaron, all the plants still looked the same, and the main thing he had learned so far was that he had no interest in herbalism whatsoever. Between Snowcloud's silence and her enthusiastic lectures on the local vegetation, he thought he preferred the former. At least when she was silent, he didn't have to pretend to listen. "When do we arrive in the valley?" Aaron asked, interrupting Snowcloud's herbalism lesson. "Perhaps another day or two," she answered. "But right now, you should concentrate on the poisonous attributes of the white witch flower. An interesting characteristic of the poison is that it works even on." As Aaron tried to look interested, his thoughts moved to the destination that was now only a few days ahead of him. Just a few more days, and he would finally see the Shadowflame Society. And, he hoped, he would finally get answers to some of the questions that plagued him. The journey from Hillfort had been unexpectedly smooth, with the well-maintained road into the mountains quiet, but by no means empty. Several times a day, they would pass trade caravans and traveling merchants making their way to or from the valley, but none of those gave them any trouble. As they higher into the mountains, the trees grew sparser, and the landscape gradually changed from its previous lush green into a rocky gray, with patches of grass and moss eventually being the only green left, which, to Aaron's joy, meant there were no more opportunities for Snowcloud to teach him about herbalism. The road kept twisting its way ever higher up the mountains, and eventually, the gray rocks gave way to white snow. Aaron looked around in amazement when he saw this. It should be late spring, but here in the mountains, the snow lay as thick as it would in the middle of winter elsewhere. And not just that, the thin air was so cold he could see his own breath when he exhaled. Yet although the snow lay thick on the mountains, the road itself remained clear, and the change in environment did not slow them much. Nevertheless, Aaron found himself wondering just how much higher they could go. To his eyes, the barren landscape looked hostile to humans, or any other life, for that matter. His question was answered when they reached a narrow pass half a day later. Barely wide enough to fit 2 wagons abreast, it seemed to be cut through the mountains, and it continued for the better part of a mile. At its end, Aaron saw a massive wall that was at least 100 feet high, and at the bottom of the wall stood an opened gate. This, Aaron knew, would be the entrance to the valley, and the sight caused him to frown in wonder. From all he knew, the Shadowflame Society existed to protect the Empire from threats beyond the border. Yet it was obvious that the fortifications here were built to protect against attacks from the Empire, as if the Shadowflame Society feared some hostile army would emerge from the Empire itself. When they reached the gate, they found several dozens of soldiers guarding it. Leading them was a broad-shouldered man in a dark gray robe, who stepped forward as they approached. "Lady Snowcloud," the man said with a small bow, his tone deferential. With a look at Aaron, he asked, "You've brought along a recruit?" "I have," she said. Although the man seemed to expect an explanation, she offered none, and after a few moments of silence, he waved them through. Beyond the gate, the pass widened sharply, expanding into a clearing that seemed large enough to hold an entire army. With a glance backward, Aaron saw that on both sides of the wall there were paths leading up into the mountains overlooking the pass. Now, he understood how much of a death trap the pass would be for any army foolish enough to attack the Shadowflame Society. Just getting through the pass would be nearly impossible, with rocks and arrows raining down from above. And if any attackers somehow broke through, they would find themselves outnumbered 100 to 1. The sight left Aaron wondering just what the Shadowflame Society was defending against, but when he turned to Snowcloud to ask, her expression quickly made him reconsider. On her face was a look of intense worry, and Aaron felt some concern as he saw it. Whatever it was that worried her could only mean bad news for him. Yet when she saw Aaron's gaze, her expression turned neutral once more. "It will be another week before we reach the capital," she said. "Once we're there, I will have you take the oath, but after that, I will need to leave for some days." "Another week?" Aaron looked at her in astonishment. "Just how large is this valley?" "It's about 500 miles from east to west," she said. "And perhaps 300 miles from north to south, at its widest." Aaron's eyes went wide when he realized just how large the valley was. He had known it was large, but this was far beyond his expectations. Just traveling to the western edge of the valley would take them weeks, if what Snowcloud said was true. "Is it really that big?" he asked, somewhat doubtful. "You'll see soon enough," Snowcloud replied plainly. At the end of the large clearing the road led them past a large camp filled with numerous barracks and other buildings, and between the buildings, Aaron could see groups of soldiers, some of them training while others sat around with bored looks on their faces. Aaron realized that the camp held a small army worth of soldiers, ready to defend the valley from the Empire at a moment's notice. That would have made sense if there was a conflict between the Empire and the Shadowflame Society, but as far as Aaron knew, the Shadowflame Society existed to guard the Empire's border from the outside world. He resolved to question Snowcloud about the matter after he took the oath she had mentioned, knowing that any questions he asked now would go unanswered. About a mile past the camp they found a town, and if it was small compared to Hillfort, it was still nearly as large as Fulai City. Snowcloud showed no signs of wanting to make a stop along the way, and Aaron had no choice but to satisfy his curiosity with what little he could see as they passed through. He saw that the streets were mostly filled with soldiers and merchants, and he understood that the town was likely built on trade with the Empire. He didn't have a chance to see much more, because hurried as Snowcloud appeared to be, it wasn't long before they had already left the town behind them. They continued for a while, following the road downward through the snowy landscape, until suddenly, after a turn in the road, Aaron stopped in his tracks. Before him, perhaps a mile below them, lay a vast green landscape. Hilly green lands stretched as far as his eyes could see, and although he knew there should be mountains farther in the distance, he could not see them. Instead, what he saw were endless rolling hills with rivers flowing between them, and what looked to be farms and towns far in the distance. When Snowcloud had told him the size of the valley, there had been some doubt in his mind, but now, none remained. The valley was large enough to be a kingdom in its own right. Chapter 98 Oathbound. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As they made their way to the capital of the Sixth Valley, Aaron was surprised at how normal the valley seemed. He had somehow expected the Sixth Valley to be like a much larger version of Windsong's monastery, filled with nothing but mages who were constantly in training. But instead, what he found were endless fields with crops and cattle, littered with small farms, and the occasional village or town. From what Aaron had seen of the valley so far, it might as well have been any random part of the empire, with the only difference being the mountains he could see in the distance behind him. Yet even those vanished into the distance as they traveled further from the valley's edges, until finally, only the thinness of the air was left to remind Aaron that they were still in the mountains. As they traveled, Snowcloud remained her quiet self. She seldom spoke, and when she did, it was about plants by the roadside. Here in the valley, there seemed to be fewer plants that caught her interest, and it wasn't unusual for them to only exchange words a few times a day. Is the entire valley like this? Aaron asked one morning. Like what? Snowcloud gave him a puzzled look. Filled with farms and villages, like the empire, Aaron said. She shook her head. There's a large region within the valley that only full members of the Shadowflame Society are allowed to enter. You'll see the walls when we reach the capital, although you will only be allowed to travel beyond them after you become an initiate. But I'm taking the oath when we reach the capital, right? Won't that make me a member of the Shadowflame Society? Recruits take the oath so that novices can teach them, she replied. But only after a year of service beyond the border will you be a true member of the society. Aaron nodded thoughtfully, once more reminded that his path within the Shadowflame Society would be long. But there was nothing for it, all he could do was continue to move ahead, impatient though he might be. In the peaceful lands of the valley, they made rapid progress, and they reached the capital several days later. Standing atop one of the hills that overlooked the city, Aaron could see the capital was large. Rivaling Hillfort in terms of size, but with buildings that looked older and grander. Yet what caught his eye was something different. Crossing straight through the city was a long wall, neatly separating the city into two distinct parts. It continued into the distance both to the east and west, stretching as far as Aaron's eyes could see. The Shadowflame region lies beyond the wall. Aaron asked, although he already knew the answer. Yes, Snowcloud said. While the rest of the valley is open to all, only society members are allowed to venture beyond it. She frowned, then added, the punishment for crossing if you're not a society member is death, so don't get any ideas. Aaron had no intention of needlessly breaking the rules, so he merely nodded at the warning. What about the city itself? He asked. Is the part beyond the wall off limits, too? It is, Snowcloud replied, then continued, the greater part of the city lies outside the wall, and is open to all. The lesser part lies inside the wall, and is only open to society members. You need not worry about accidentally crossing into that part, a single gate connects the two, and only members of the society are allowed to pass. With that, they continued onward to the city, and it wasn't long before they reached their destination. Immediately, Aaron could see that the city was far older than Hillfort. Although it was lively with commerce and traffic, few buildings looked to be less than a century old, and many seemed far older than that. The environment gave Aaron a strange feeling, as if he had somehow wandered centuries into the past, or perhaps into a place that existed out of time. We'll get the oath taken care of, first, Snowcloud said. After that, I will take you to an inn, where you can wait until I return. She clearly knew the city well, expertly guiding Aaron through the streets toward the city center. Although he had little time to look around, he already saw several things that caught his interest: stores that claimed to sell magical scrolls and items, alchemists, and other places where he might be tempted to part with some of his excess coin. After a time, they arrived at a large building that looked even more ancient than the rest of the city. It was vast and massive, built from weathered gray stone that looked like it had survived untold centuries, with several large towers, and walls so thick they made the building resemble a fortress. At the front of the building was a wide stone staircase that led up to a large portico supported by massive stone pillars. Beyond the portico lay the entrance, with a set of vast doors that were at least 20 feet high. Currently, the doors stood open, and guarding the entrance were over a dozen men and women in robes that suggested they were mages. Although they didn't quite have the disciplined look of normal guards, they more than made up for it with the power Aaron knew they held. Snowcloud led Aaron past the guards' disinterested glances and into the building, where he found a large entrance hall. Without pausing, she took him to the back of the hall, where a number of people were seated at large wooden desks. She approached one of them, a middle-aged man, then gestured at Aaron. "He's here to take the oath." The man gave Aaron an examining look and nodded. "Very well," he said to Snowcloud. Then, he turned to Aaron. "You should know that once you enter the chamber, there is no changing your mind. Once you enter, the punishment for refusing to take the oath is death." Death. Aaron was taken aback when he heard this. "Can I know what the oath is, first?" "You can't," the man answered plainly. "If you want to change your mind, now is." "I'll take the oath," Aaron interrupted him. Although he didn't like the idea of staking his life without even knowing what he would have to promise, there was no turning back now. "Follow me," the man said, standing up from the desk. Aaron followed the man through some hallways, until they finally reached a large, circular chamber. The chamber was empty but for a single pedestal at its center, upon which lay a white disc-shaped object. The man closed the door and walked toward the pedestal, taking the disc in his hand. He motioned for Aaron to approach, then handed him the disc. Aaron accepted it with some hesitation. It was heavier than he had expected, and its smooth surface felt strangely cold to the touch. "Repeat the following words," the man said, "and as you do, do not resist the power of the oath disc." Aaron nodded, although he was somewhat surprised at the lack of ceremony. "I shall not teach the true path to those unbound by the oath," the man said slowly, then looked at Aaron expectantly. With a start, Aaron realized the phrase sounded familiar. Some months ago, Darkfire had told him he had once overheard his parents mention that academy mages were weak because they followed a false path. Now, it seemed, Aaron was finally on the verge of learning about a different approach to magic, a stronger one, he hoped. "Be nov calm," the man coughed softly, and Aaron was reminded that he was supposed to repeat the words. "I shall not teach the true path to those unbound by the oath," he said hurriedly. At once, he felt a wave of cold emanating from the disc. It lasted only a moment, but even so, he could feel it spreading through his body, seemingly reaching every part of him. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the sensation ended. A moment later, the man nodded thoughtfully. He reached out with his hand, clearly expecting Aaron to return the disc. "That's it?" Aaron asked, handing the disc back to the man. Ignoring Aaron's question, the man placed the disc back on the pedestal, then said, "Hold out your left hand." Aaron did as he was asked and extended his left hand. The man reached out and took it, then turned it over, exposing the inside of Aaron's wrist. To Aaron's surprise, a small black mark could now be seen on his inner wrist, shaped like a flame. At first glance, it looked like a tattoo, but when Aaron examined it more closely, he could see that it moved as if it was burning. Chapter 99 Urgent Matters. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The man closely examined the mark on Aaron's wrist, seeming to study every detail at length. Aaron was already beginning to worry that something was wrong when the man finally nodded. "From this day forth," the man said in a serious tone, "you will be unable to teach the true path to those outside the society, who haven't taken the oath." "But I don't even know what the true path is," Aaron replied. What if I talk about it unintentionally? You don't need to worry about that, the man said, a practiced smile on his face. The oath will prevent you from discussing anything related to the true path with outsiders, whether you intend to or not. Aaron frowned. What happens if I try to do it anyway? You will find that you are unable to do so, the man replied. Even archmages are unable to break the oath. So that's it. I'm free to discuss other society matters with whomever I choose. Of course not, the man said. Carelessly sharing the society's other secrets and techniques with outsiders will be punished, possibly with death. Then why not include those things in the oath? Aaron asked. If the society had a way to create a binding oath, he thought, it made little sense to use it only for a single thing. The oath is intended to protect only the society's most treasured secret, not to take away your freedom to choose, the man said. But what about, the novice who recruited you will answer any further questions you have, the man interrupted Aaron. Before Aaron could object, the man ushered him into the hallway, then guided him back to the entrance hall. All done? Snowcloud asked when she saw them return. The man nodded, then added, but I think your recruit has more questions to ask. He'll just have to be patient, she replied. She appeared to be in a hurry as she led Aaron out of the building, curtly dismissing any questions he tried to ask. They arrived at a small inn not long after. You will stay here until I come back, she said. Once I return, there will be plenty of time to discuss things. Why are you in such a hurry? Aaron asked. After the weeks they had spent traveling, a few hours spent answering his most pressing questions hardly seemed like too much to ask. I have private matters to attend to, she replied. Urgent ones. Aaron sighed in frustration, but the look in her eyes made it clear that she would not reveal more. Not right now, at any rate. When will you return? He asked. I should be back in a few days, she said. Until then, you can explore the city. Once I return, we will head to the border, and you can ask all the questions you want. With that, she departed, leaving Aaron behind at the inn. He spent the first few days wandering around the city, but although there was much to see, he had little interest in the sights the city had to offer. Perhaps someone with an interest in architecture or history would have been intrigued by so old a city, but to Aaron, after the first dozen ancient buildings, those that followed just looked like more of the same. More interesting were the people. Even this side of the city held plenty of Shadow Flame initiates and novices, and although few of them were willing to speak more than a few words to a mere recruit, just observing them granted Aaron some insights. From what he could tell, many initiates and all novices appeared to be body refiners. How strong they were exactly he could not tell, but just the fact that he could recognize them as body refiners meant they would not be weak. He also spent some afternoons observing the building where he had taken the oath, curious about the other recruits and the novices leading them. With some regularity, he saw novices leading small groups of recruits into the building, then emerging some time later. Unlike Snowcloud, however, these novices did not leave their recruits behind in the city. Instead, they left the city almost immediately, traveling further west, to the border, Aaron assumed. These weren't the only people to enter the building, however. Almost as often as he saw novices with groups of recruits, he saw what looked to be parents taking youths inside. Remembering Darkfire's history, Aaron suspected that these youths were born within the Sixth Valley. As he recalled, that would allow them to join the Shadow Flame Society the moment they opened a realm, without first having to spend a year across the border. Seeing the youths, Aaron could not help but feel some envy. While he would have to spend a year proving himself, society membership was simply handed to them, with no requirements other than opening a realm and taking the oath. Still, Aaron knew that complaining about how unfair it was would not help him, and he quickly decided not to linger on the matter. The only thing it would do was cause him frustration. Finally, he spent much of his time exploring the city's many stores, in hopes of finding some useful spells, artifacts, or whatever else might catch his eye. Unfortunately, the stores proved to be a disappointment. Although there were some that sold magical items like body-strengthening potions and realm scrolls, none of the goods were of much use to him. Nor, for that matter, were they worth the exorbitant prices the shopkeepers charged. When Aaron inquired if there were better goods to be had, he was told that more potent magical items were only sold in the other half of the city, the half that he wasn't yet allowed to enter. Discouraged but not dissuaded, he nevertheless diligently searched many of the city's stores in hopes of finding at least something worth buying. But after several days of fruitlessly browsing dozens of stores, he was finally forced to accept defeat. By then, it had been nearly a week since Snowcloud left, and he was beginning to feel worried. What if she didn't return for weeks or months, or worse, not at all? The thought of being left stranded in the Sixth Valley by himself wasn't an appealing one, and having to find a new novice to follow would be even worse. Yet these worries were only replaced with new ones when Snowcloud returned. He was awakened in the dead of night by a series of loud knocks on his door. When he got up and opened the door, he saw that it was Snowcloud, with a tense look on her face. "Get your things," she said. "We're leaving right now." Chapter 100 Running. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Aaron followed Snowcloud out of the inn, and in short order, they had left the city behind. "How long can you run before you get tired?" she asked him. "As long as I need to," Aaron said. Although he had never tested the limits of his endurance, he knew that even running at a sprint for hours did not leave him noticeably tired. "Then follow me," she said. In an instant, she dashed off along the road, her moonlit silhouette almost disappearing in the distance before Aaron could even respond. Immediately, he followed, sprinting after her. He caught up a few moments later, then slowed his pace to match hers as he ran beside her. "Why are we in such a hurry?" he asked. Although he did not know the reason, he would have been a fool not to understand that she was fleeing something. And anything that was cause enough for her to flee would certainly be a danger to him. "I will tell you when," she began. "No," Aaron said, unable to fully keep the anger from his voice. "You're going to tell me now. I've had enough of running around like a headless chicken, without the slightest idea of what's going on. You either tell me why we're running right now, or I'm heading back to the city." Only when he said the words did he realize that he actually meant them. He was sick of getting into dangerous situations while only barely knowing what was happening. If he was to place himself in danger, he would only do so knowingly. And if that meant he would have to return to the city to find some other novice to join, then so be it. There was a moment of silence from Snowcloud, but then, she spoke. "All right." Despite his insistence, Aaron was surprised at the response. As far as he knew, she hadn't wanted a recruit with her in the first place, so his threat to leave could barely be considered a threat at all. Yet somehow, it had worked. "So what's going on?" he asked. "The Sixth Valley has chosen a new leader," Snowcloud said, "Elder Fawn." "They've replaced the Patriarch?" Aaron asked with a start. "Not exactly," she said. "Elder Fawn is only a temporary leader, chosen to maintain order as the valley prepares to select a new patriarch." "So your grandfather, is he?" "No," she replied. "Not yet, at least. He is unwell. But Elder Fong has asked me to remain in the valley, to help bolster support for the new patriarch when he is selected." "And you're afraid he will try to seize power for himself, and use you?" "Elder Fong. He has neither the spine nor the brain for that. The problem lies with the factions. With the selection of a new patriarch so close, the support of the old patriarch's closest family is crucial for all the contenders. And I am the only close family grandfather has left." "What about your parents?" Aaron asked, realizing that although he knew she was the patriarch's granddaughter, he had heard nothing of her parents. Snowcloud was silent for some moments. When she finally spoke, there was a slight tremble in her voice. "My mother disappeared beyond the border about 2 years after grandfather fell ill. My father left to find her, but he never returned. Then." Aaron began to speak, but the words died in his mouth. There was no need to tell Snowcloud how suspicious it all sounded, she was certainly aware of that. Things will be dangerous for me, within the valley, she continued. Until now, I have managed to remain neutral, but if any faction suspects that I might support one of their rivals. She did not need to finish the sentence for Aaron to understand the danger. If her support really was that important to the factions, then so was keeping their rivals from gaining it. At once, he realized that traveling with her would be more dangerous than any other option he could have chosen, and the irony of it nearly caused him to burst into laughter. After spending weeks carefully trying to choose the safest path, he had instead stumbled upon the most dangerous one. "Do you still wish to travel with me?" she asked. Aaron did not answer immediately. If he wanted to remain safe, insofar as that was possible, his best choice would be to turn around right now. Yet this time, if he chose to go ahead, he would do so while knowing the dangers that lay ahead. "I'll come along," he said finally. Although he wasn't sure the choice was the right one, at least he would be able to face the threats ahead with open eyes. "All right," she replied. "I will answer any other questions you have once we're safely outside the valley." This time, Aaron did not object. Even if there were many things he still wanted to ask, he had to admit that this was hardly the right moment to ask them. They kept running through the night, and then the day that followed, not pausing for even a moment. If Elder Fong wanted to keep Snowcloud inside the valley, then he would likely send word to the soldiers at the border, and their best chance to get away was to be gone before then. By the end of the day, Aaron began to feel tired. Even if his body was able to bear the physical exertion of running without pause, the lack of sleep was clouding his mind, and several times he felt himself on the verge of nodding off even as he ran. "Take this," Snowcloud said, tossing him a small flask. "It will help you stay awake." Aaron opened the flask and swallowed its contents. Immediately, his face twisted in disgust. The liquid was beyond foul, so bitter it made him gag in revulsion. "What the hell was that?" he blurted out, fearful that the liquid would make its way back up his throat, forcing him to taste it a second time. "Yellow flax extract and rock bean grounds," she replied. "The taste is slightly unpleasant, but it should keep you awake." Although the taste was far beyond unpleasant, Aaron soon discovered that she hadn't been lying about the liquid's effects. His weariness disappeared almost instantly, being replaced by a feeling of boundless energy, along with a throbbing headache and a feeling in his chest that made him fear his heart could explode at any moment. Yet even if the liquid's effects were unpleasant, it did its job in keeping Aaron awake, and he did not feel the slightest bit tired as they ran through another sleepless night. They reached the western border of the valley by the end of the second day, and Aaron was unsurprised to see that it resembled the valley's eastern border. Here, too, stood a large camp filled with soldiers, protecting fortifications that seemed like they could withstand even 100 armies. They had stopped running when they neared the camp, knowing that it would draw unwanted attention, but they did not waste any time in heading to the gates. At the gates, they found a group of soldiers, led by a weary-looking black-robed man. As they approached, the man gave them an examining look. "Best wait until tomorrow before you cross," he said. "The descent isn't safe in the dark." "We'll be going now," Snowcloud said. The man hesitated, then shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, then waved them through. They passed unhindered, but even as they did, Aaron had trouble controlling his nerves. At any moment, he thought, word from Elder Fong could arrive, and the soldiers would come after them. Yet despite his fears, nothing happened, until they finally passed out of sight of the fortifications and the many soldiers manning them. They glanced at each other, looks of relief on both their faces. Then, without saying a word, both of them began to run once more. By the time the light of dawn began to appear, they had made it to the foot of the mountains. Somehow, they had managed to avoid any serious injuries. Although Aaron had fallen several times, he had not plunged into a ravine as he feared, instead merely sustaining some cuts and bruises. "Now what?" Aaron asked with a look at the road ahead of them. "Now, we leave the road," Snowcloud replied. And we run until we can't run anymore. Aaron yawned. Do you have any more of that? He nearly gagged just remembering the liquid's taste. As much as you need, she said, handing him a flask. Aaron opened the flask, then steeled his will and downed the liquid inside in a single swig. Half of it came up again immediately, and he was forced to swallow it a second time. Let's go, he said.